The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have. 3 days had passed since we buried Richard, and here I sat in my living room, holding the final words of a man I thought I knew completely after 32 years of marriage. "Mom, can we just get this over with?" Jessica shifted impatiently in the leather armchair that had been Richard's favorite spot. At 28, she carried herself with the same authoritative air that had made her father such a successful businessman, but today there was something different in her eyes. Something calculating. "Please let me just read through this properly." I adjusted my reading glasses and tried to focus on the legal jargon swimming before my eyes. The grief was still so fresh that simple tasks felt monumental. Asterisk to my beloved wife Margaret Elizabeth Harrison, I leave. Asterisk. "Mom, did you remember to cancel Dad's gym membership?" Michael interrupted from the sofa where he sat beside his sister. My son had flown in from Seattle the moment we got the news about Richard's heart attack, but he'd been distant, almost cold, since the funeral. I looked up from the will, frustrated. "Can this wait? We're trying to. It's just that they charge monthly, and if we don't cancel soon," Jessica added. "Fine, yes, I'll call them tomorrow." I turned back to the document. Asterisk to my beloved wife Margaret Elizabeth Harrison, I leave the family home at 1247 Oakwood Drive, along with all furnishings and asterisk. What about the boat? This time it was Sarah, my youngest at 24, who spoke up from her perch on the window seat. She'd been quieter than the other two, but I caught her exchanging meaningful glances with her siblings throughout the afternoon. "I haven't gotten to that part yet." My voice carried more edge than I intended. "If you could all just let me read. We just want to understand what's happening with Dad's assets," Michael said, but there was something off about his tone. Too casual. Too rehearsed. I continued reading, but the interruptions came like clockwork. Every few sentences, one of them would pipe up with a question about insurance policies, or bank accounts, or Richard's collection of vintage watches. By the time I'd made it halfway through the document, they'd interrupted me 20 times. 20. I'd started counting after the 10th interruption, when I realized something was deeply wrong with this picture. These weren't the eager, grieving questions of children worried about their family's security. These were probing, strategic inquiries that felt almost professional. "Mom!" Jessica's voice cut through my growing suspicion. "You stopped reading." I looked up to find all three of them staring at me with expressions I'd never seen before. There was no warmth there, no shared grief. They looked at me like I was an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved, like I didn't exist as their mother, but merely as someone standing between them and something they wanted. "I think that's enough for today," I said quietly, folding the will and slipping it back into the envelope. "But Mom, we need to know about the business," Michael pressed. "Dad's company, the investments." "Tomorrow," I said firmly, standing up. "I need some time to process this myself first." The look that passed between my children in that moment chilled me to the bone. It was the look of conspirators whose plan had hit a snag. That night, I lay in the bed I'd shared with Richard for 3 decades, staring at the ceiling and replaying every interaction from the afternoon. Something was happening here, something that went deeper than impatient grief or concern about finances. My children, the 3 people I'd devoted my life to raising, were hiding something from me. And whatever it was, they thought I was too stupid or too distracted by grief to notice. They were wrong. The next morning I called our family lawyer, David Chen, who had been Richard's friend since law school and had drawn up our wills 5 years ago. "Margaret, I'm so sorry for your loss." David's warm voice carried genuine sympathy. "Richard was a good man. I'm still having trouble believing he's gone." "Thank you, David. I was wondering if you could come by the house this afternoon. The children want to go through Richard's will together, and I think it would help to have you explain some of the legal language." "Of course, I'd be happy to. Around 2 o'clock. "Perfect." After I hung up, I sat in Richard's study, surrounded by the remnants of his life. His reading glasses still lay folded on his desk next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. His coffee mug, the one that read "World's Best Dad," sat empty beside his computer monitor. I opened the desk drawer where he kept important documents and found something that made my blood run cold. There, beneath a stack of insurance papers, was a manila envelope identical to the one I'd been reading from yesterday. But this one was sealed with "Final Will and Testament, Richard James Harrison" typed across the front. My hands shook as I compared the two envelopes. The one I'd been reading from yesterday was a photocopy. Someone had made a copy of Richard's will and given it to me instead of the original. But who? And why? The answer hit me like a physical blow. My children had somehow gotten their hands on Richard's will before I had. They'd read it, copied it, and then orchestrated yesterday's reading to watch my reaction. But what were they looking for? What did they expect to find? I thought about calling David immediately, but something held me back. If my own children were deceiving me about something this important, I needed to understand why before I revealed what I'd discovered. Instead, I drove to the electronics store downtown and purchased a small digital recorder, the kind that could easily be hidden in a pocket or purse. If my family wanted to play games, I'd make sure I had evidence of whatever they were really up to. That afternoon, I positioned myself in the living room 30 minutes before David was scheduled to arrive. Jessica, Michael, and Sarah had all shown up early, which confirmed my suspicions that something was orchestrated about this gathering. "Did you finish reading through everything last night, Mom?" Sarah asked, settling into the same window seat as before. "I got through most of it," I lied, patting the envelope beside me on the sofa. The real envelope, the sealed one I'd found in Richard's desk. Michael nodded approvingly. "Good. We really need to understand the full scope of Dad's estate." There it was again, that clinical, detached way of speaking about their father's death. Like he was a business acquisition rather than the man who'd taught them to ride bikes and helped with their homework and walked them down aisles at their weddings. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I stood to answer it, slipping my hand into my cardigan pocket to press the record button on the small device hidden there. "David, thank you so much for coming." I hugged our longtime family friend, feeling guilty about the deception I was about to uncover, but knowing I had no choice. "Of course, Margaret." "Hello, Jessica, Michael, Sarah." David nodded to each of my children as I led him into the living room. "I have to say, your father would be proud to see you all here together, taking care of your mother during this difficult time. If only he knew," I thought bitterly. "David," I said, settling back onto the sofa with the envelope in my hands, "before we begin, I need to ask you something important." "Certainly." I took a deep breath and looked directly at my children as I spoke. "When exactly did you last speak with Richard about his will?" David looked confused. "Well, we updated both your wills about 5 years ago, remember? When you bought the vacation home in Colorado." "Why do you ask?" "Because," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me, "I found something interesting yesterday." Jessica, Michael, and Sarah all tensed simultaneously, like guilty suspects in a police lineup. I held up the envelope I'd been reading from the day before, the photocopy. "This is what I was reading yesterday. But it's not the original will, is it?" David frowned, examining the envelope more closely. "No, that appears to be a copy." "Margaret, where did you get this?" "That's exactly what I'd like to know." I turned to face my children fully. "One of you gave this to me instead of the real will. The question is, which one of you has been in Richard's personal files, and why?" The silence that followed was deafening. My children exchanged those same conspiratorial glances I'd noticed before, but now there was panic mixed with a calculation. "Mom," Jessica finally spoke, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. "We were just trying to help. We knew you were overwhelmed with grief, so we thought. You thought you'd read through your father's will before I did and decide what information I could handle." The anger in my voice surprised even me. "You thought you'd treat me like a child who couldn't be trusted with her own husband's final wishes." "It's not like that," Michael protested, but his face had gone pale. "Then what is it like?" I stood up, still gripping both envelopes. "Because from where I'm sitting, It looks like my 3 children conspired to deceive me about something as sacred as their father's last testament. David looked increasingly uncomfortable. Perhaps I should come back another time. No, I said firmly. Because I want witnesses to whatever truth is about to come out. I held up the sealed envelope, the real one. This is Richard's actual will. The one I found locked in his desk drawer. The one none of you wanted me to see first. Sarah burst into tears, but there was something performative about her sobs. Mom, please, you don't understand. Then make me understand. I exploded. Make me understand why my own children, the people I raised to value honesty and integrity above everything else, would lie to my face while I'm grieving the loss of my husband. The room fell silent except for Sarah's theatrical weeping. Jessica and Michael sat frozen, caught between confession and continued deception. David, I said, turning to our lawyer, I'd like you to read Richard's actual will aloud. The real one. And I want my children to hear every single word. David nodded solemnly and accepted the sealed envelope from my hands. He carefully opened it and unfolded the document inside. As he began to read, I watched my children's faces carefully. I, Richard James Harrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make, publish and declare this to be my last will and testament. Hereby revoking all wills and codicils heretofore made by me. Standard opening language. Nothing unusual there. First, I direct that all my debts and funeral expenses be paid from my estate. Still routine. But I noticed Michael shifting uncomfortably. Second, to my beloved wife Margaret Elizabeth Harrison, I leave our family home at 1247 Oakwood Drive, along with all furnishings, personal effects, and the sum of $500,000 from my life insurance policy. I frowned. Yesterday's version had mentioned the house but not the insurance money specifically. David continued reading, but I was watching my children's reactions more than listening to the words. Jessica had gone rigid in her chair. Sarah's tears had stopped abruptly. Michael was staring at his hands like he wished he could disappear. Third, to my business partner Thomas Mitchell, I leave my 50% stake in Harrison and Mitchell Construction, with the understanding that he will maintain the company's current employment practices and charitable giving commitments. This was new. Yesterday's version had made it sound like the business would be part of my inheritance. Fourth, to my daughter Jessica Harrison Walsh, I leave the sum of $50,000, to be held in trust until she completes treatment for her gambling addiction. Jessica shot to her feet. That's not, he couldn't have. But David kept reading, his voice growing more somber with each revelation. Fifth, to my son Michael Harrison, I leave the sum of $50,000, contingent upon his full disclosure to his wife about the debts he has accumulated through his cryptocurrency investments. Michael's face crumpled. Dad promised he wouldn't tell anyone about that. Sixth, to my daughter Sarah Harrison Kim, I leave the sum of $50,000, provided she enters and completes a rehabilitation program for her prescription drug dependency. Sarah's performative tears became real sobs of shame and rage. David paused, looking around the room at the devastation these revelations had caused. Should I continue? Please, I whispered, sinking back onto the sofa as the full picture began to emerge. Finally, I must address a matter that weighs heavily on my heart. In the past year I have discovered that each of my 3 children has approached me privately, requesting large sums of money to address various personal crises. Jessica needed funds to cover gambling debts that threatened her marriage. Michael required money to hide investment losses from his wife and creditors. Sarah asked for help covering the costs of prescription medications she was obtaining illegally. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece. In each case, I provided the requested assistance while strongly encouraging my children to seek professional help for their respective problems. In each case, they promised to get help but failed to follow through. Instead, they returned months later with even larger requests for financial assistance. David's voice grew heavy with emotion as he continued reading what was clearly a father's heartbroken final message to his children. I love my children deeply, but I have come to realize that my financial support has enabled rather than helped them. Therefore, the inheritance I leave them is contingent upon their willingness to address the underlying issues that have led them to make poor choices. I felt like I was hearing about strangers, not the 3 people I'd raised from infancy. How had I missed so much? How had Richard known all of this while I remained completely in the dark? To my beloved wife Margaret, I must confess that I kept these struggles private to protect you from worry and to preserve your relationship with our children. I hoped they would resolve these issues on their own, but it has become clear that intervention is necessary. David looked up at me with profound sympathy. There's more, but it's quite detailed about the specific conditions of each bequest. Read it all, I said numbly. I need to hear everything. As David continued, the full scope of my children's deception became clear. Not only had they hidden their personal crises from me, but they had also been pressuring Richard for increasingly large sums of money. Jessica owed over $200,000 to various casinos and online gambling sites. Michael had lost nearly $300,000 in high-risk cryptocurrency trades and had been lying to his wife about their family's financial situation. Sarah had been purchasing prescription opioids illegally and was spending thousands per month on her addiction. Worse still, according to the will, all 3 of them had approached Richard together 6 months ago with a proposal. They wanted him to change his will to leave them equal shares of his entire estate, cutting me out except for the house and a modest living allowance. Richard had refused, but the fact that they'd made such a request revealed the depth of their desperation, and their callousness toward me. When David finished reading, the silence stretched on for what felt like hours. My children sat in various states of collapse. Jessica crying angry tears, Michael staring at the floor in shame, and Sarah curled up in the window seat like a wounded animal. Finally Jessica spoke, her voice raw with emotion. "You don't understand, Mom. We're in real trouble here. We need help." "You need help," I agreed quietly. "But not the kind of help you've been asking for. The gambling thing isn't that bad," Jessica continued desperately. "I can control it. I just had some bad luck lately. Bad luck that cost you $200,000. It's not like I meant for it to get so out of hand." Michael looked up from his hands. "Mom, the crypto market is just going through a rough patch. If I can just hold on to my positions a little longer." "With what money, Michael? According to your father's will, you've already lost your family's savings." "It's not lost, it's invested. There's a difference." "Is there? Because it sounds to me like you gambled with your family's future just as recklessly as Jessica gambled with hers." I turned to Sarah, who was still crying in the corner. "And you, sweetheart? Prescription drugs. How long has this been going on?" "It started with my back injury," she whispered. "The pain pills helped, and then when the prescription ran out I needed them to function. But instead of getting help, you decided to buy them illegally. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" "I tried to stop," Sarah sobbed. "I really tried. But everything hurts without them, and I can't handle stress and so you came to your father for money instead of coming to me for support." The hurt in my own voice surprised me. These revelations weren't just about my children's problems. They were about how completely they'd shut me out of their lives when they needed help most. "We didn't want to worry you," Michael said weakly. "Worry me? You didn't want to worry me." I laughed bitterly. "So instead you decided to lie to me, manipulate me, and treat me like an enemy to be managed rather than a mother who loves you?" "That's not what we were doing," Jessica protested. "Really? Then explain yesterday. Explain the photocopied will, the 20 interruptions, the meaningful glances, the way you all looked at me like I was some stranger who had wandered into your meeting." None of them had an answer for that. David cleared his throat gently. "Margaret, I think your husband's intentions with these conditional bequests were to motivate your children to seek help. The money is still there for them, but only if they're willing to address their underlying problems. I understand Richard's intentions, I said. What I'm trying to understand is how 3 people I raised to be honest, compassionate, and responsible adults could turn into strangers who would conspire against their own mother. We're not strangers, Sarah whispered. We're your children. We're scared. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of the maternal instinct that had guided me for 30 years. But it was tempered now by the painful knowledge that my children had been living double lives, hiding their struggles while treating me as an obstacle to be overcome. Being scared doesn't excuse lying, I said gently but firmly. Being scared doesn't excuse the way you treated me yesterday, or the way you've been treating me since your father died. We just need the money, Mom, Jessica said, dropping all pretense. We can figure out the other stuff later, but right now we need cash. And there it is, I said sadly. The truth finally comes out. This isn't about grief or family, or honoring your father's memory. This is about money. It's been about money all along. Michael stood up abruptly. Of course it's about money. Do you have any idea what kind of pressure we're under? Jessica's marriage is falling apart because of her debts. My wife is going to leave me when she finds out what I've done. Sarah could go to prison for buying drugs illegally. And whose fault is that? The sharpness in my voice cut through the room. Whose choices led to these consequences? Life led to these consequences, Jessica shouted back. Real life, with real problems that can't be solved with good intentions and moral lectures. No, I said, standing to face my children. Your choices led to these consequences. Your choice to gamble money you didn't have. Your choice to make risky investments with your family's security. Your choice to turn to illegal drugs instead of seeking proper medical help. I looked at each of them in turn. And your choice to lie to me, manipulate me, and treat me like an enemy instead of coming to me for help when you needed it most. The weight of these revelations was crushing, but underneath the pain was a growing sense of clarity. For the first time in days, maybe months, I understood what was really happening in my family. David, I said, turning to our lawyer, what exactly do the conditional terms require? David consulted the will again. For Jessica, documented enrollment in and completion of a gambling addiction treatment program through a licensed facility. For Michael, full financial disclosure to his spouse and enrollment in financial counseling. For Sarah, enrollment in and completion of a drug rehabilitation program. And if they don't meet these conditions, then their portions of the inheritance would be donated to the charities your husband supported. I nodded slowly. Richard was a wise man. Even at the end, he was trying to help our children help themselves. Mom, please. Sarah stood up from the window seat, her face streaked with tears. Can't you just override the will somehow? We'll get help, I promise, but we need the money now. No, I said quietly. No. Jessica's voice rose in disbelief. What do you mean, no? I mean no. Your father's will stands exactly as he wrote it. If you want your inheritance, you'll meet his conditions. But you could contest it, Michael pressed. As his widow, you have rights. I do have rights, I agreed. I have the right to honor my husband's final wishes. I have the right to support his efforts to help you, even from the grave. And I have the right to refuse to enable the behavior that put you in these situations in the first place. The look of shocked betrayal on my children's faces was almost more than I could bear. But Richard's words from the will echoed in my mind. Financial support had enabled rather than helped them. You're just going to let us lose everything? Jessica asked incredulously. You've already lost everything that matters, I replied sadly. You've lost your integrity, your honesty, and your respect for the people who love you most. The money your father left you is meant to help you find those things again. This is unbelievable, Michael muttered, sinking back onto the sofa. Our own mother is abandoning us when we need her most. I'm not abandoning you, I said firmly. I'm supporting the same thing your father was supporting. Your recovery, your healing, your chance to rebuild your lives on solid ground instead of on lies and quick fixes. But what if we can't do it? Sarah's voice was small and frightened. What if we try to get clean or get help and we fail? For the first time since this ordeal began, I heard something genuine in my daughter's voice. Not manipulation, not calculation, but real fear and vulnerability. I moved to sit beside her on the window seat and took her hands in mine. Then you try again. And again. And I'll be here to support you through every attempt. But you won't give us the money. I won't enable your addictions or your poor choices, I clarified. But I'll give you something much more valuable. I'll give you my time, my presence, and my unwavering belief that you can overcome these problems. Jessica scoffed from across the room. Belief doesn't pay debts, Mom. Neither does enabling, I replied. Your father tried to help you by giving you money, and all it did was make your problems worse. Maybe it's time to try something different. David had been sitting quietly through this family confrontation, but now he cleared his throat. If I may, I think Richard's approach was quite thoughtful. The conditional bequests provide both incentive and resources for recovery, but they require genuine commitment rather than just promises. Easy for you to say, Michael grumbled. You're not facing bankruptcy and divorce. You're right, David acknowledged. I'm not. But I've seen many families destroyed by financial enabling. Richard was trying to break that cycle. I looked around the room at my children, really looked at them, and tried to see past their anger and desperation to the people they could become again. Jessica had been a brilliant student before her gambling took over. Michael had been a devoted husband and father before his investment obsession consumed him. Sarah had been pursuing a career in social work before her injury led to addiction. They were still there, buried under layers of poor choices and desperate lies. Richard's will was offering them a path back to themselves. I want to make something very clear, I said, standing up and moving to the center of the room where I could see all three of them. Your father's conditions aren't punishment. They're a lifeline. And I'm going to support you in meeting them in every way I can, except by circumventing them with money. What does that mean? Sarah asked. It means I'll drive you to treatment centers and sit in waiting rooms. I'll go to family counseling sessions and learn how to be a better support system. I'll babysit Michael's kids while he sorts out his financial mess and rebuilds trust with his wife. I'll do whatever it takes to help you succeed. I paused, making sure each of them was listening. But I won't give you a shortcut that prevents you from doing the hard work of recovery. The room fell quiet again as my children processed this declaration. I could see them struggling between their immediate desperation for money and the possibility that there might be another way forward. Finally, Sarah spoke up. The rehab programs are expensive. How am I supposed to pay for treatment if I don't have access to my inheritance? Richard thought of that too, David interjected, consulting the will again. The inheritance funds can be used directly for qualified treatment programs, but they have to be approved facilities, and the money goes straight from the estate to the treatment center. So we can get help, but we can't get cash, Michael summarized bitterly. Exactly, I said. Your father was trying to make sure the money actually went towards solving your problems instead of just postponing the consequences. Jessica had been quiet for a while, but now she looked up with an expression I hadn't seen from her in years. Genuine vulnerability. Mom, what if we're too broken to fix? What if the treatment doesn't work? The question broke my heart, but it also gave me hope. For the first time in this entire ordeal, one of my children was asking about recovery rather than just money. Then we keep trying until it does work, I said simply. And we do it together as a family. But what about our debts in the meantime? Michael asked. My credit is ruined, Jessica's marriage is hanging by a thread, and Sarah could face legal consequences. Those are the natural consequences of the choices you've made, I said gently but firmly. Running from them hasn't worked. Maybe it's time to face them and work through them. David nodded approvingly. Actually, there are often legal protections and debt forgiveness programs available for people who can demonstrate they're actively addressing addiction issues. The key is showing genuine commitment to change. You mean if we actually go to treatment, it might help with the other problems too? Sarah asked. It's not a magic solution, David cautioned, But courts and creditors are generally more lenient with people who are actively seeking help rather than just making excuses. I could see something shifting in my children's expressions. The desperate, cornered look was gradually being replaced by something that might have been the beginning of hope. "This is all assuming we actually want to get better," Jessica said quietly. "What if we like gambling and drugs and risky investments? What if we don't want to change?" It was an honest question, and it deserved an honest answer. "Then you'll lose your inheritance," I said matter-of-factly. "And more importantly, you'll lose any chance of having a real relationship with me going forward." The bluntness of my statement seemed to shock them. "You'd cut us off," Michael asked. "I'd stop enabling you," I corrected. "There's a difference. I'll always love you, but I won't participate in your self-destruction anymore." I thought about Richard lying in his hospital bed those final hours, and how he'd squeezed my hand when I promised to take care of everything. At the time, I thought he meant the funeral arrangements and the paperwork. Now I understood he meant taking care of our children, really taking care of them, not just giving them what they wanted. "Your father spent the last year of his life trying to help you while protecting me from the knowledge of how serious your problems had become," I continued. "He died carrying the weight of your secrets and the fear that you'd never get better." Sarah started crying again, but this time her tears seemed genuine rather than manipulative. "I don't want his sacrifice to be meaningless," I said. "I want his final gift to you, this chance to get help, to actually make a difference in your lives." David stood up, gathering the will papers. "I think this has been enough for today. You all need time to process this information and decide how you want to move forward." "Wait," Jessica said suddenly. "I have a question about the treatment requirement. Does it have to be inpatient? Because I have kids to take care of." The fact that she was asking about logistics rather than trying to find loopholes felt like progress. "The will specifies appropriate professional treatment," David replied. "That could include intensive outpatient programs for someone with family responsibilities. And the financial counseling for Michael. Same flexibility. The important thing is that it's legitimate professional help, not just promises to do better." I could see my children's minds working, possibly for the first time considering compliance rather than just circumvention. "What about time limits?" Michael asked. "How long do we have to start these programs?" David consulted the will again. 6 months to begin treatment, with regular progress reports required. "And if we complete the programs successfully?" Sarah's voice was almost hopeful. "Then you receive your full inheritance, along with a letter your father wrote to each of you," David said gently. Letters he hoped you'd earn the right to read. This was the first I'd heard of letters, and the mention of them seemed to affect my children deeply. The idea that their father had left them personal messages, but only if they got help, added an emotional dimension that pure financial incentive couldn't provide. Can we think about this?" Jessica asked hesitantly. "Of course," I said. "But while you're thinking, I want you to consider something else." They looked at me expectantly. "I want you to consider what your father went through this past year, knowing that 3 people he loved more than life itself were slowly destroying themselves, and feeling like he couldn't save them." I had to pause to compose myself before continuing. "I want you to consider what it was like for him to die wondering if he'd failed as a father, wondering if there was something more he could have done to help you." The impact of these words was visible on my children's faces. For the first time, they seemed to be thinking about someone other than themselves. "And I want you to consider what it's like for me now, finding out that while I was planning Richard's funeral, my children were scheming about how to get around his final wishes." Michael winced. "Mom, we never meant." "I know you never meant to hurt me," I interrupted. "But you did. You hurt me, and you hurt your father, and you're hurting yourselves." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Richard had spent so many weekends tending. "Your father planted that garden knowing he might not see another spring. But he planted it anyway, because he had faith that something beautiful could grow from the work he put in." I turned back to my children. "That's what his will is. Seeds he planted in hopes that something beautiful might grow in your lives. But seeds only grow if they're given the right conditions. Sarah had stopped crying and was listening intently. What kind of conditions? Honesty, commitment, the willingness to do hard work even when it's uncomfortable. I looked at each of them. And the courage to ask for help from people who love you. We are asking for help, Jessica protested. We asked Dad for help, and now we're asking you. No, I said sadly. You're asking for money. Help is different. Help means accepting guidance, following through on commitments, and being willing to change the behaviors that created the problems in the first place. The distinction seemed to register with them. David gathered his papers and prepared to leave. I'll leave you all to discuss this privately. Margaret, if you need anything else, please don't hesitate to call. After he left, the four of us sat in silence for a long time. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the room where we'd shared so many family moments over the years. Birthday celebrations, holiday mornings, homework sessions, and heart-to-heart talks. All of it seemed like a lifetime ago now. Mom. Sarah's voice was small. Yes, sweetheart. I'm scared. These two simple words carried more honesty than anything else my children had said to me in months. I know you are, I replied gently. What are you most scared of? Failing. Getting clean and then messing up again. Having everyone know how bad things got. He paused. Disappointing you and Dad even more than I already have. Jessica and Michael were listening to their sister with expressions I recognized. The faces of people who were finally hearing their own fears spoken aloud. Can I tell you something your father used to say? Yes. They nodded. He used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing even when you're terrified. I moved to sit beside Sarah again. You're all terrified right now, and that's completely understandable. But you have a choice. You can let that fear drive you to keep making the same mistakes, or you can let it motivate you to finally make different choices. What if we try and we fail? Michael asked quietly. Then you'll fail as people who were brave enough to try, I said. And that's infinitely better than succeeding as people who were too afraid to. And that's infinitely better than succeeding as people who were too afraid to change. The room grew quiet again, but this silence felt different. Less hostile, more contemplative. Jessica was the first to break it. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Okay. Do you think we're bad people? The question caught me off guard, not because it was difficult to answer, but because it revealed how much my children's self-worth had been damaged by their struggles. No, I said without hesitation. I think you're good people who have made bad choices. There's a difference. But we lied to you. We manipulated you. We were willing to cut you out of Dad's will if it meant getting more money for ourselves. Yes, you did all of those things, I acknowledged. And those were terrible choices that hurt people you claim to love. But they don't define who you are at your core. I looked at Jessica, really looked at her. I remember when you were 7 years old and you found a wallet on the playground at school. You insisted that we drive all over town until we found the owner so you could return it, even though it meant missing your favorite TV show. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. That little girl who cared more about doing the right thing than about her own convenience. She's still in there. She's just been buried under a lot of fear and poor decisions. I turned to Michael. I remember when you were in high school and you worked 3 jobs to save money for college because you didn't want your father and me to have to sacrifice for your education. You were so proud of your independence, so determined to make your own way. Michael's jaw tightened with emotion. That young man who valued hard work and integrity. He's still in there too. Finally, I looked at Sarah. And I remember when you were in college and you volunteered at the homeless shelter every weekend, even when you were overwhelmed with schoolwork. You said you couldn't stand knowing that people were suffering when you had the ability to help. Sarah covered her face with her hands. That compassionate young woman who wanted to dedicate her life to helping others. She's the real you. Everything else is just noise. The 3 of them sat with this for a moment, and I could see them trying to reconcile the people they used to be with the people they'd become. I don't know how to get back there, Jessica whispered. One choice at a time, I said. Starting with the choice to accept help instead of running from your problems. Michael looked up suddenly. What about you, Mom? Are you okay? I mean, really okay? The question surprised me. In all of this drama, no one had asked about my well-being. Honestly, no, I'm not okay. I'm grieving the loss of my husband, and I'm also grieving the discovery that my children have been living lies for years. I feel like I failed as a mother, and I feel like I failed your father by not seeing what was happening. You didn't fail, Sarah said quickly. We hid it from you. Yes, you did. But that doesn't absolve me of responsibility. I should have seen the signs. I should have asked harder questions. I should have been more involved in your lives instead of assuming everything was fine. I paused, thinking about the past few years and how many warning signs I'd missed or ignored. Your father tried to protect me from the truth about your struggles, but maybe that was a mistake. Maybe if I'd known sooner, we could have addressed these problems before they became so severe. Dad was just trying to take care of you, Michael said. I know. But I'm not a fragile flower who needs to be protected from reality. I'm your mother, and dealing with your problems, really dealing with them, not just throwing money at them, is part of my job. Jessica leaned forward. So what does that mean going forward? It means no more secrets, I said firmly. No more protecting me from difficult truths. No more dealing with your father or me as separate entities you can manipulate differently. I stood up and moved to the center of the room again. If you decide to get treatment, I want to be involved. I want to go to family therapy sessions and learn how your addictions work and understand what I can do to support your recovery without enabling your problems. And if we don't get treatment, Sarah asked quietly, then you'll have chosen to continue living lies, and I won't be part of that anymore. The finality in my voice seemed to register with all three of them. Mom, Michael said slowly, I think I need to tell you something. I braced myself for another revelation. When I lost all that money in crypto, I didn't just lose my savings. I borrowed against the house without telling Lisa. If I can't pay it back soon, we could lose everything. The admission hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Does Lisa know? Yes. No. I keep telling myself I'll figure out a way to fix it before she finds out, but... He trailed off, his face crumpled with shame. But there is no way to fix it without telling her the truth, I finished. He nodded miserably. Michael, your wife has a right to know that her home is at risk. She has a right to be part of the solution instead of being blindsided by the consequences of your choices. She'll leave me, he whispered. She might, I agreed. But she might also stay and help you work through this if you give her the chance. Right now, you're making that choice for her by keeping her in the dark. Jessica had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. This is exactly why we need the inheritance money now, she said. Michael's about to lose his house, I'm about to lose my marriage, and Sarah could go to jail. We don't have time for treatment programs and counseling sessions. Those problems didn't develop overnight, I pointed out. They're not going to be solved overnight either, no matter how much money you throw at them. But money would buy us time. Money would buy you temporary relief, I corrected. Just like it has every other time your father bailed you out. And then in 6 months or a year, you'd be back in the same situation, only worse. I sat back down, feeling suddenly exhausted by the weight of these revelations. Let me ask you something, I said. If your father had given you unlimited access to money over the past year, where do you think you'd be right now? The question seemed to catch them off guard. Jessica was the first to answer. I probably would have gambled more. And you, Michael? I probably would have made even riskier investments, thinking I could win it all back. Sarah, I would have bought more pills, she admitted quietly. So the money wouldn't have solved your problems. It would have made them worse. They all nodded reluctantly. That's why your father's approach was so thoughtful. He wasn't trying to punish you. He was trying to break the cycle that was destroying your lives. I looked around the room, at the family photos on the mantelpiece, at the comfortable furniture we'd chosen together over the years, at all the physical reminders of the life Richard and I had built for our children. You know what your father's greatest fear was? Yes. They waited for me to continue. That he'd raised children who thought love could be bought. That you'd learn to equate financial support with emotional support. And that you'd never develop the strength to solve your own problems. Sarah flinched. Is that what you think too? I think you've all forgotten that you're capable of much more than you're currently doing, I said. I think you've gotten so used to having someone else solve your problems that you've stopped believing you can solve them yourselves. But we can't, Jessica protested. Not without help. Getting professional treatment is getting help, I pointed out. Asking your father for money to avoid the consequences of your choices, that's not getting help. That's getting a bailout. The distinction seemed to be sinking in. Michael stood up and began pacing, a habit he'd had since childhood when he was working through a difficult problem. Okay, he said finally. Let's say we all agree to do what Dad's will requires. Jessica goes to gambling addiction treatment, I get financial counseling and tell Lisa the truth, and Sarah goes to rehab. Yes. What happens to us as a family? I mean, do we still have relationships with each other after all this? It was a fair question, and one I'd been wrestling with myself. That depends on you, I said. Are you willing to do the work of rebuilding trust? Are you willing to be honest going forward? Are you willing to accept that recovery is an ongoing process, not a one-time fix? And if we are, then we have the chance to become a real family again, instead of a group of people who share DNA and financial obligations. Sarah looked up from her corner. What do you mean, a real family? I mean a family where people tell each other the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Where people ask for help when they need it instead of suffering in silence or resorting to manipulation. Where people support each other's growth instead of enabling each other's worst impulses. I paused, thinking about the family dinners we'd shared over the years, and how even then, I'd sensed that everyone was performing rather than really connecting. I mean a family where we actually know each other, not just the versions of ourselves we present to avoid conflict or judgment. That sounds... Jessica hesitated. Scary. It is scary, I agreed. Real intimacy is terrifying because it requires vulnerability. It's much easier to keep people at arm's length with lies and surface-level interactions. But it's also lonely, Sarah added quietly. Yes, it's also lonely. Michael stopped pacing and looked at me directly. Mom, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Were you and Dad really happy? I mean really happy, or were you just good at pretending? The question took me aback. Why do you ask? Because if we're talking about being honest with each other, I want to know if the marriage we thought we were modeling our own relationships after was actually as solid as it seemed. I thought about Richard, about our 32 years together, about the fights we'd had and the challenges we'd weathered and the deep contentment we'd found in each other's company. We were really happy, I said finally. Not perfect, not without problems, but genuinely happy. We liked each other as much as we loved each other, which I think is rare. Then why didn't any of us learn how to do that? Jessica asked. It was a profound question, and one I didn't have a complete answer for. I think maybe we protected you too much from seeing us work through difficulties, I said slowly. We wanted to shield you from adult problems, so we solved most of our conflicts privately. Maybe that gave you the impression that healthy relationships don't involve struggle or hard conversations. I thought about the fights Richard and I had had over the years, about money, about parenting decisions, about career choices, and how we'd always made sure to argue away from the children. Your father and I did disagree about how to handle your problems this past year, I admitted. He wanted to keep helping financially while encouraging you to get treatment. I would have preferred to stop the financial support sooner and make treatment a requirement for any ongoing help. You would have cut us off, Michael asked. I would have set boundaries, I corrected. There's a difference between abandoning someone and refusing to enable their self-destructive behavior. So Dad was the soft touch and you would have been the hard ass, Jessica said with a slight smile, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in days. Something like that. But we never had the chance to really disagree because he didn't tell me the full extent of what was happening. I felt a pang of sadness thinking about the burden Richard had carried alone. I think he was afraid that if I knew how bad things had gotten, I'd want to cut you off completely. He was trying to find a middle ground that would help you while preserving your relationship with me. And instead, he died carrying all that stress by himself, Sarah said sadly. Yes, and that's another reason why secrets are so dangerous. They don't just hurt the people being lied to, they hurt the people keeping the secrets. The late afternoon light was fading now, and I realized we'd been talking for hours. The conversation felt like major surgery, painful but necessary, and potentially healing if we could survive the process. I need to ask you all something, I said. They looked at me expectantly. Are you ready to stop living like this? Are you ready to stop lying, stop hiding, stop treating the people who love you like obstacles to be managed? One by one they nodded. It wasn't enthusiastic, but it seemed genuine. And are you ready to do the hard work of recovery, even if it's uncomfortable and scary and takes longer than you want it to? This time, the nods were more hesitant. Because I need you to understand something, I continued. If you start treatment programs and then quit when they get difficult, if you make promises you don't keep, if you try to manipulate the system to get your inheritance without actually changing, I will consider that a final answer about who you've chosen to be. The weight of this ultimatum settled over the room. You mean you'd cut us off permanently? Jessica asked. I mean I'd accept that you've chosen your addictions over your family, and I'd stop pretending otherwise. It was harsh, but I'd learned something important from Richard's will. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set clear boundaries and stick to them. That seems extreme, Michael said. What seems extreme to me is spending years watching your father slowly break his heart trying to save 3 people who didn't want to be saved, I replied. What seems extreme is discovering that my children were willing to conspire against me while I was planning their father's funeral. The reminder of their recent behavior seemed to chasten them. We really hurt you, didn't we? Sarah asked softly. Yes, you really hurt me. And you hurt your father. And you're hurting your spouses and children with your lies and your problems. I stood up and moved to the window again, looking out at Richard's garden in the twilight. But here's what I want you to understand, I said without turning around. Despite everything that's happened, despite all the lies and manipulation and broken promises, I still believe you can get better. I still believe you're capable of becoming the people you were meant to be. I turned to face them. Your father believed it too. That's why he structured his will the way he did. Not to punish you, but because he had faith that if you were given the right motivation and the right resources, you could turn your lives around. And if we can't? Jessica asked quietly. Then at least you'll fail knowing that 2 people who loved you more than life itself believed you were worth the effort. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt pregnant with possibility rather than heavy with despair. Finally Sarah spoke up. How do we start? You start by making a choice, I said. Right now, today, you choose whether you want to keep living the way you've been living, or whether you want to try something different. I want to try something different, Sarah said, and for the first time in months, she sounded like my daughter instead of a stranger. Me too, Michael added quietly. Jessica was quiet for a long moment. What if I'm too far gone? What if I can't stop gambling even with professional help? Then you'll find out what you're really made of, I said. And so will the rest of us. She nodded slowly. Okay. I want to try too. I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief exactly because I knew this was just the beginning of a long journey, but something like hope. Then tomorrow we start making phone calls, I said. We research treatment programs and therapists and support groups. We figure out logistics and insurance and childcare. We do the practical work of turning these good intentions into real action. Together, Sarah asked. Together, I confirmed. As a family. A honest family, finally. As my children prepared to leave that evening, each of them hugged me. Really hugged me, not the perfunctory embraces we'd been exchanging since Richard's funeral. Mom, Jessica said as she was putting on her coat. Yes. I'm sorry. For all of it. For lying to you, for treating you like the enemy, for everything we put Dad through. I know you are, sweetheart. Do you forgive us? It was a complicated question. Forgiveness wasn't something I could manufacture on demand, and I wasn't sure it was something they'd truly earned yet. I forgive your desperation, I said carefully. I understand that fear can make people do terrible things. But forgiveness for the lies and the manipulation, that's something we'll have to work toward as you prove that you're committed to changing. She nodded, accepting the honesty even though it probably wasn't what she wanted to hear. After they left, I sat alone in the living room where this confrontation had taken place, holding Richard's real will in my hands. The house felt different now. Not lighter exactly, but more honest. The weight of secrets had been lifted, even though the weight of recovery still lay ahead. I thought about the small digital recorder in my pocket, still running, still capturing everything that had been said. I'd started recording to protect myself from whatever game my children were playing. But listening back to portions of our conversation later that night, I realized I'd captured something else entirely. I'd captured the sound of a family falling apart and then, maybe, beginning to come back together. The next morning I made the first phone call, to a treatment center that specialized in gambling addiction. Then I called a financial counselor who worked with people in crisis. Then I researched drug rehabilitation programs. Each call was difficult, requiring me to explain my adult children's problems to strangers and ask for help I'd never imagined needing. But each call also felt like progress, like I was finally doing something constructive instead of just reacting to one crisis after another. By the end of the week, we had a plan. Jessica would enter an intensive outpatient program for gambling addiction while her husband watched the kids. Michael would begin individual and couples counseling to address both his financial problems and the damage his lies had done to his marriage. Sarah would start with a medically supervised detox program followed by residential treatment. None of it would be easy. None of it would be quick. And there was no guarantee that any of it would work. But for the first time since Richard's death, maybe for the first time in years, we were facing our problems instead of running from them. And that, I thought, was exactly what Richard had hoped his final gift would accomplish. As I sat in his study that evening, surrounded by the remnants of his life and the beginnings of our family's recovery, I whispered a promise to his memory. I won't let your death be meaningless. I won't let their problems destroy what we built. And I won't give up on them, no matter how hard this gets. Outside, his garden was preparing for spring, the bulbs he'd planted last fall beginning to push through the soil toward the light. Just like the seeds of hope he'd planted in his will, waiting for the right conditions to finally grow.